May 24, 1943, North Atlantic, 450 miles southwest of Iceland. Kapitän Lieutenant Hans-Joachim Schwantke stood in the conning tower of U-223, scanning the grey horizon through salt-encrusted binoculars. 41 days at sea, 17 days since the last contact with BDU, Befehlshaber der U-Boote, U-Boat Command, and no sign of the convoy intelligence had promised would be here. His war diary entry from the previous evening read, "Fuel reserves at 40%, provisions adequate for 12 more days. Morale remains high. The crew trusts in German engineering and our tactical superiority. The enemy cannot detect us. We remain the hunters." In 6 hours, those words would become tragically ironic as British aircraft equipped with ASV Mark III radar, technology the Kriegsmarine had dismissed as impossible, would locate his submerged U-boat, drop depth charges with devastating accuracy, and send U-223 to the bottom of the Atlantic with all hands. The German naval establishment had laughed when British intelligence captured in 1940 suggested the Allies were developing airborne radar capable of detecting surface submarines in total darkness. The report seemed absurd. Radio waves couldn't detect small targets like submarine conning towers against ocean clutter. The wavelengths required for such detection would require impossibly large antenna arrays, and even if detection were somehow possible, the technology would be too heavy and power-intensive for aircraft installation. Submarines were safe on the surface at night. The physics made detection impossible. German U-boat doctrine in 1943 still relied on surface operations. Submarines spent 90% of their time on the surface, diving only when threatened by aircraft or warships. Surface running allowed diesel engines to power the boat at 17 knots, 4 times the submerged speed of 4 knots on battery power. Surface operations enabled long-range patrols, rapid pursuit of convoys, and wolfpack tactics that had devastated Allied shipping in 1940 to 1942. The U-boats were the pride of the Kriegsmarine, sophisticated submarines that could patrol for 60 days, dive to 200 meters, fire torpedoes that sank ships 3 times their size. They'd brought Britain to the edge of starvation, sinking over 3,000 merchant ships and nearly winning the Battle of the Atlantic through unrestricted submarine warfare. German naval officers called them the weapon that will win the war. Allied sailors called them metal coffins. By May 1943, the coffins had stopped surfacing, not because U-boats had achieved perfect stealth, but because Allied technology had made surface operations suicidal. Airborne radar, shipborne direction-finding equipment, advanced sonar, and improved depth charges were systematically destroying the U-boat fleet faster than German shipyards could replace losses. The Germans never understood how completely the technological advantage had shifted until it was too late to matter. The doctrine of surface superiority. German U-boat tactics in early 1943 were the refined product of 3 years of increasingly successful Atlantic operations. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine and former commander of the U-boat fleet, had developed wolfpack tactics that exploited U-boat advantages: speed on the surface, long-range detection capability using crew lookouts, radio coordination between submarines to concentrate forces against convoys. The tactical cycle was elegant and deadly. U-boats patrolled assigned areas on the surface, moving at 17 knots using diesel engines, covering vast oceanic expanses. When a submarine spotted a convoy, either through visual sighting or radio intercept of convoy communications, it transmitted contact reports to BDU headquarters in France. Dönitz's operations staff vectored additional U-boats toward the convoy, assembling a concentration of 10 to 20 submarines. The pack attacked at night when visibility favored submarines. Low-profile U-boats were nearly invisible against dark ocean, while merchant ships were silhouetted against sky. U-boats penetrated convoy screens on the surface, moving faster than most escort vessels, using superior speed and maneuverability to slip between escorts. They fired torpedoes from point-blank range, 1,000 meters or less, and escaped on the surface before escorts could respond. The tactics had been devastatingly effective. In 1942, U-boats sank over 1,600 Allied merchant ships. Approximately 7.8 million tons of shipping, more than Allied shipyards could replace. British imports fell to critically low levels. Food reserves dropped to 6 weeks' supply, fuel reserves to 8 weeks, strategic materials to crisis levels. Churchill later wrote that the U-boat threat was the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war. German confidence in U-boat tactics was reinforced by technological assessment of Allied anti-submarine capabilities. German naval intelligence evaluated Allied defenses as primitive and ineffective. Visual lookouts that couldn't detect submarines at night, sonar that was unreliable and short-ranged, depth charges that had to be dropped almost directly on top of submarines to cause damage. Allied aircraft posed minimal threat. They could only attack submarines they could see, and submarines on the surface at night were invisible. Even in daylight, a lookout on a U-boat could spot an aircraft approaching from 5 to 10 miles away, giving the submarine time to dive before the aircraft arrived. Once submerged, the U-boat was safe. Aircraft couldn't detect submerged submarines, couldn't attack what they couldn't find. When intelligence reports in 1941 suggested the British were developing airborne radar for submarine detection, German naval engineers dismissed the reports as technically impossible. Radar detection of small targets required short wavelengths, 10 centimeters or less, and generating such wavelengths required cavity magnetron tubes that didn't exist. Even if such tubes could be developed, the power requirements would be beyond aircraft electrical systems, and the antenna arrays would be too large for aircraft installation. Fregattenkapitän Werner Hartmann, chief of the Kriegsmarine's Technical Intelligence Section, reviewed the reports and issued his assessment in December 1941. British claims regarding centimetric radar for aircraft are propaganda designed to reduce U-boat effectiveness through psychological intimidation. Our technical analysis confirms that such radar cannot be developed with current technology. The wavelengths required for small target detection cannot be generated at sufficient power levels. U-boats should continue surface operations without concern for nocturnal air attack. Night surface running remains safe. The assessment was catastrophically wrong. British scientists had developed the cavity magnetron in February 1940, creating a device that could generate 10-centimeter radar wavelengths at kilowatt power levels. By 1942, ASV Mark III radar was being installed in Allied patrol aircraft, providing detection ranges of 12 miles against surfaced submarines. But German intelligence never discovered this. Allied operational security was nearly perfect, and the few U-boats that encountered the new radar didn't survive to report it. The Golden Age, 1940–1942. To understand the catastrophic collapse of 1943, it's essential to understand the dominance U-boats enjoyed during the previous 3 years. From September 1939 through early 1943, German submarines had systematically devastated Allied merchant shipping, sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. The early successes created what U-boat crews called Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time, a period from June through October 1940 when U-boats operated almost without opposition. France had fallen, giving Germany bases on the Atlantic coast that eliminated the need to transit around Britain. British defences were minimal, few escort vessels, primitive detection equipment, no effective air cover in mid-Atlantic. During this period, individual U-boats achieved staggering success. Captain Lieutenant Otto Kretschmer, commanding U-99, sank 47 merchant ships totaling 274,333 tons, more than any other submarine commander in history. His tactics were aggressive and ruthless, surface attacks at night, firing from point-blank range, targeting the largest and most valuable ships first. Kretschmer described his philosophy in his patrol reports. "We attack on the surface at night when we are invisible. We penetrate the convoy screen using superior speed. We select targets methodically, tankers first, then large freighters, then smaller vessels. We fire one torpedo per ship to conserve ammunition. Properly aimed, one torpedo is sufficient. We do not surface to give survivors time to abandon ship. Sentiment has no place in warfare. Our advantage is complete surprise combined with ruthless execution. The enemy cannot see us, cannot detect us, cannot defend against us. We are ghosts that kill and vanish." The second happy time came in early 1942, when Germany declared war on the United States. American coastal waters were completely undefended. Cities remained fully lit at night, silhouetting merchant ships against the glow. No convoy system existed, no air patrols, minimal naval presence. U-boats operated off the American coast like wolves among sheep. In the first 6 months of 1942, submarines sank over 600 ships in American waters, tankers carrying oil from the Caribbean, freighters hauling raw materials, coastal vessels conducting routine commerce. The slaughter was so intense that beaches from Florida to New Jersey were covered with oil and debris from sunken ships. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan, commanding U-123 during Operation Drumbeat, the initial assault on American shipping, described the experience. "We surfaced off New York Harbor and could see the lights of the city illuminating the sky. Ships passed within a few hundred meters, completely unsuspecting. We sank ship after ship, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single night. The Americans seemed completely unprepared for submarine warfare. Ships sailed independently without escorts, maintained normal lighting, transmitted radio messages without encryption. It was almost too easy. We felt like executioners rather than warriors. But the easy hunting created dangerous overconfidence. German naval officers began believing that Allied defenses would never improve, that U-boats would maintain their dominance indefinitely. When intelligence reports warned of Allied technological developments, the reports were dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. Dönitz wrote to Hitler in March 1942, "The U-boat remains the decisive weapon in the war against England. Allied defenses are primitive and ineffective. Our submarines operate with near impunity across the Atlantic. With sufficient boats, 300 operational submarines, we can cut Britain's supply lines completely and force surrender within 6 months. The enemy has no effective countermeasures against submarine operations. Their technology is years behind ours. Their tactics are defensive and reactive. As long as we maintain production and replace normal losses, the U-boat offensive will succeed." The assessment was accurate for March 1942. It would be catastrophically wrong by March 1943. The technology gap widens. While German U-boats continued operating using 1940 tactics, Allied anti-submarine technology advanced with stunning speed. The transformation was driven by desperation. Britain faced starvation if the U-boat threat couldn't be neutralized, and every available resource was devoted to defeating the submarines. The revolution began with radar. The ASV Mark III, air-to-surface vessel radar Mark III, employed 10-centimeter wavelengths that could detect U-boat conning towers against ocean clutter. The system was installed in Coastal Command aircraft starting in early 1943. consolidated B-24 Liberators, short Sunderland flying boats, Vickers Wellington bombers equipped with enormous rotating antennae under the fuselage. The radar provided detection capability that was almost magical compared to visual search. Aircraft could locate surfaced submarines in total darkness, in fog, in rain, any weather condition that would blind human lookouts. Detection range against a surfaced U-boat was approximately 12 miles, giving aircraft time to position for attack before the submarine could detect the threat and dive. Lee lights complemented the radar, powerful searchlights mounted in aircraft bellies, capable of illuminating submarines during the final approach to attack. The tactic was brutally effective. Radar detected the submarine at 12 miles. The aircraft descended to attack altitude during approach. The Lee light illuminated the target in the final seconds before the crew could react, and depth charges fell on submarines that never saw the aircraft approaching. Squadron leader Humphrey de Verde Lee, who developed the searchlight system, described the tactical advantage. Before the Lee light, we could detect submarines with radar but couldn't attack them effectively in darkness. By the time we reached the radar contact position, the submarine had heard our engines and dived. The searchlight solved this problem. We could approach in darkness using radar for navigation, then illuminate the target in the final seconds. The submarine crew would see nothing until the light came on, at which point they had perhaps 10 seconds before depth charges fell. 10 seconds is insufficient time to close hatches, flood tanks, and dive. The submarines were caught on the surface, helpless, destroyed before they could submerge. High-frequency direction finding, HF-DF or HUF-DUF, provided another technological advantage. The system detected U-boat radio transmissions and calculated the bearing to the transmitting submarine. Multiple direction-finding stations triangulated submarine positions with remarkable accuracy, often within 20 miles, sometimes within 5 miles. The tactical implications were devastating for U-boats. German Wolfpack tactics required radio communication. Submarines transmitted contact reports when sighting convoys. BDU transmitted vectoring instructions to concentrate forces. Every transmission revealed the submarine's position to Allied direction-finding networks. Convoy escorts equipped with HF-DF could locate U-boats shadowing convoys, vector aircraft to attack positions, or maneuver to force submarines to dive and lose contact. Captain Gilbert Roberts, who directed the Western Approach's tactical unit, the British Anti-Submarine Warfare Training Centre, revolutionized escort tactics using game theory analysis and operational research. His team analyzed hundreds of convoy battles, identifying patterns in U-boat attacks and developing countermeasures. The resulting tactical innovations transformed escort effectiveness. Support groups of 4 to 6 escort vessels that could leave convoy formations to hunt submarines detected by HF-DF, coordinated aircraft and surface ship attacks that kept submarines submerged and exhausted their batteries, aggressive offensive patrols ahead of convoys that forced submarines to dive before making contact. Roberts described the tactical evolution. Early in the war, escorts were purely defensive. They reacted to submarine attacks, attempting to protect merchant ships after U-boats had already penetrated the screen. This gave the initiative to the submarines. We transformed escort doctrine to be offensive. We hunted submarines before they could attack, using direction finding to locate them, using aircraft to force them down, using support groups to pursue contacts to destruction. We turned the hunters into the hunted. Improved sonar, the British called it ASDIG, provided better detection of submerged submarines. The Type 144 and Type 147 ASDIC systems had longer range, better resolution, and improved ability to maintain contact during depth charge attacks. Escort vessels could detect submerged U-boats at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards and maintain contact through multiple attack runs. Most importantly, depth charges improved dramatically. The Torpex-filled depth charge contained 50% more explosive power than TNT charges. A near miss that might have damaged a submarine with TNT would crush the hull with Torpex. Settings allowed depth charges to detonate at 500 feet or deeper, reaching submarines attempting to escape by diving below previous weapon-effective depths. The Hedgehog forward-throwing weapon launched 24 contact-fused projectiles ahead of the attacking ship, allowing escorts to attack without losing sonar contact. Traditional depth charge attacks required the escort to pass over the submarine, losing sonar contact during the critical seconds when charges were dropped. The Hedgehog eliminated this blind spot. The escort maintained continuous sonar contact, fired the weapon forward, and could observe whether projectiles hit the submarine. The weapon's lethality was remarkable. 24 projectiles covered an area 140 feet in diameter. Any submarine within that area would be hit by multiple projectiles, each containing 35 pounds of Torpex explosive. A single hit was usually fatal. The contact fuse ensured detonation directly against the hull, focusing explosive force to penetrate the pressure hull rather than dissipating in water. By May 1943, Allied anti-submarine forces possessed comprehensive technological superiority. They could detect surfaced submarines at night using radar, locate U-boats through radio direction finding, track submerged submarines with improved sonar, and attack with weapons far more lethal than anything available in 1940. The Germans knew none of this. Their intelligence assessment of Allied capabilities remained frozen in 1941, based on technology that had been obsolete for 2 years. The warning signs ignored. German intelligence received warnings throughout 1942 that Allied anti-submarine capabilities were improving, but the warnings were systematically dismissed or misinterpreted. The pattern of institutional blindness was remarkably similar to what had happened with code-breaking and airborne operations. Evidence that contradicted existing assumptions was reinterpreted to fit those assumptions rather than prompting reassessment. In August 1942, U-464 was sunk by aircraft in mid-Atlantic while surfaced at night. The submarine was operating as a supply boat, a large Type 14th U-boat designed to refuel and resupply combat submarines at sea, extending their operational range. The boat was surfaced, conducting refueling operations with another submarine, when a British Wellington bomber appeared overhead and dropped depth charges that sank U-460s with all hands. The sinking was unusual. The aircraft had approached from astern, apparently undetected by lookouts until it was directly overhead. The attack occurred during moonless night when visual detection should have been impossible beyond a few hundred meters. The attacking aircraft appeared to have known the submarine's exact position. BDU's investigation concluded that the aircraft had been guided to the target by radio direction finding. Detecting the radio transmissions between the two submarines during refueling coordination, the investigation recommended reducing radio communications during vulnerable operations, but concluded that the incident didn't indicate any fundamental change in Allied detection capabilities. The explanation was partially correct. HFDF had located the general area where submarines were operating. But what the investigation missed was that airborne radar had enabled the aircraft to locate the submarines precisely and attack in total darkness. German analysts couldn't conceive that such radar existed, so they constructed explanations that didn't require it. In November 1942, U-272 reported being attacked by aircraft on 3 consecutive nights while surfaced in mid-Atlantic. The submarine's commander Captain Lieutenant Heino Bowman described the attacks in his patrol report. On 3 successive nights, enemy aircraft appeared overhead without warning and dropped depth charges. Each attack occurred during darkness with excellent visibility. Lookouts maintained continuous watch, but failed to detect approaching aircraft until bombs were falling. Weather conditions should have made visual detection of our surfaced boat impossible. The aircraft appeared to know our exact position before beginning their attack runs. Bowman's report reached BDU headquarters and triggered an investigation by the Technical Intelligence Section. Hartmann's assessment, dated November 28, 1942, concluded: the repeated attacks on U-272 suggest improved Allied air patrol patterns rather than new detection technology. The aircraft likely conducted systematic search patterns in areas where U-boat operations were expected. The commander's observation that aircraft appeared to know his exact position is likely perceptual error caused by the stress of combat. Aircraft conducting visual search patterns may appear to approach directly toward a target they actually detect only at close range. We find no evidence of new Allied detection capabilities. The attacks, while concerning, do not indicate any fundamental change in the tactical situation. The assessment was completely wrong. The aircraft had detected U-272 using ASV Mark III radar, tracked the submarine continuously from initial detection to attack, and attacked using Lee lights for final illumination. But Hartmann couldn't imagine this technology existed, so he constructed alternative explanations. By March 1943, U-boat loss rates had increased significantly. 15 boats lost that month, versus 9 in March 1942. BDU operations staff noticed the trend, but attributed it to increased Allied air patrols and convoy escort strength, rather than technological change. Dönitz wrote in his war diary on March 31, 1943, U-boat losses have increased, but remain within acceptable limits relative to ships sunk. The enemy has committed more escort vessels and patrol aircraft to Atlantic operations, increasing the probability of contact. However, our submarines continue to operate effectively, and the exchange ratio remains favorable. We see no indication of fundamental changes in Allied detection capabilities or tactics. The increased losses reflect increased Allied commitment of resources, not technological breakthrough. With adequate boat numbers, the U-boat offensive will continue to succeed. The assessment would prove tragically wrong within 6 weeks. May 1943, the turning point. Schwantke's U-223 was one of 60 U-boats operating in the North Atlantic during May 1943, concentrated in an area southwest of Iceland where BDU expected major convoys to pass. The concentration represented Germany's maximum effort. Every available submarine committed to decisive battle against Allied shipping. Dönitz had promised Hitler that May would see the highest sinking totals of the war, that the U-boat offensive would starve Britain into surrender. The reality was catastrophic. In May 1943, U-boats sank 50 Allied merchant ships, approximately 264,000 tons of shipping, but Allied forces sank 41 U-boats in the same month, over 30% of submarines at sea, the highest loss rate of the entire war. The exchange ratio had inverted. Instead of sinking 10 merchant ships for every U-boat lost, the Germans were losing almost 1 submarine for each merchant ship sunk. The losses were concentrated among the North Atlantic wolf packs, the submarines operating in exactly the area where Dönitz had concentrated his forces. U-boats sailing into the patrol area never returned. Contact reports abruptly ceased mid-transmission. Submarines that reported attacking convoys went silent and never made subsequent transmissions. At BDU headquarters in Paris, Donitz's operations staff tracked submarine positions on large plotting tables, moving markers across the Atlantic as submarines reported their locations. Through May, markers stopped moving, boats transmitted position reports and then vanished. The staff would wait for scheduled transmission times. When submarines failed to report, the markers were moved to a board listing boats presumed lost. By May 15th, the presumed lost board held 15 markers, submarines that had reported positions within the past week but hadn't made subsequent transmissions. By May 20th, the total reached 25 boats. By May 23rd, 38 submarines were missing. The patrol area southwest of Iceland had become what submariners began calling the Black Pit, a region where U-boats entered and never emerged. Crews departing French bases for patrol in the Black Pit wrote farewell letters to families, settled personal affairs, and said goodbye to friends with the understanding they likely wouldn't return. Oberleutnant Herbert Werner, commanding U-415, described the atmosphere at the U-boat base in Brest. "We knew that boats sailing for the North Atlantic rarely came back. The operations board showed dozens of submarines marked as missing or overdue. Every day brought news of another boat lost. Crews we'd trained with, commanders we'd shared drinks with, men we'd known for years. The morale was terrible. Men reported for duty knowing they were sailing to their deaths. Some requested transfers to other services, requests that were denied because U-boat losses required every available crew. A few deserted, disappeared the night before departure, preferring court-martial to certain death in the Atlantic. We sailed anyway because orders were orders and because German submariners didn't quit. But we knew, everyone knew, we were sailing in Coffins, and the only question was when they would seal." Dönitz called an emergency conference on May 24th, summoning his operational staff and technical advisors to explain the catastrophic losses. The meeting transcripts, preserved in Kriegsmarine archives, reveal growing comprehension that German U-boats were facing some new threat they didn't understand. Korvettenkapitän Günther Hessler, Dönitz's operations officer, opened the briefing with statistical analysis. "In the first 24 days of May, we have lost 38 boats, confirmed or presumed sunk. This represents 31% of submarines committed to North Atlantic operations. If losses continue at this rate, the entire operational U-boat fleet will be destroyed within 6 months. Loss patterns suggest most boats are being detected and attacked while surfaced, at night, under conditions where they should be invisible to enemy aircraft. Multiple surviving commanders report being caught on the surface by aircraft that appeared without warning. No radar warning, no acoustic detection, no visual sighting until the aircraft was directly overhead. The enemy possesses detection capability we do not understand." Fregattenkapitän Hartmann presented the technical assessment. Analysis of attack patterns suggests the British have deployed airborne radar capable of detecting surfaced submarines. This contradicts our previous assessment that such radar was technically impossible with current technology. However, the evidence is overwhelming. Aircraft are locating submarines in total darkness, in weather conditions that prevent visual detection, and attacking with precision that suggests they're tracking submarines continuously until within weapon release range. We must conclude the British have achieved a technological breakthrough that defeats our surface operations. The room fell silent. Admitting that Allied technology had surpassed German capabilities violated every principle of Nazi technological superiority doctrine. But the evidence couldn't be denied. U-boats were dying, and the only explanation was that the enemy could detect surfaced submarines at night. Dönitz made the most painful decision of his career. Effective immediately, withdraw all boats from the North Atlantic. Suspend Wolfpack operations until we develop countermeasures to enemy detection capabilities. The current operational situation is unsustainable. We are losing submarines faster than we can replace them. This is not surrender. This is tactical repositioning to preserve the U-boat force while we develop responses to enemy technology. The Battle of the Atlantic is not over, but we cannot continue operations under current conditions. Withdraw. The withdrawal order went out May 24, 1943. Submarines received emergency transmissions ordering them to break contact with convoys, proceed to French bases, avoid Allied air patrols. For the first time in the war, Germany's U-boat fleet was retreating. Hans-Joachim Schwantke never received the withdrawal order. U-223 had been operating under radio silence for 3 days, while stalking a suspected convoy. At 17:35 hours, May 24th, a British B-24 Liberator of 120 Squadron detected U-223's radar signature at 14 miles, approached under cloud cover, and dropped 6 depth charges that straddled the submarine. The explosions crushed U-223's pressure hull at frames 40 through 60, flooding the forward torpedo room and control room simultaneously. The boat plunged stern first toward the bottom, sinking through 2,000 meters of water in less than 30 seconds. The pressure hull imploded at approximately 300 meters depth, well beyond the submarine's rated collapse depth, killing anyone who'd survived the initial explosions. Schwantke and his 49 crew members died without understanding what had killed them. Victims of technology they'd been assured was impossible. The British aircraft that destroyed U-223 transmitted a brief radio report. Submarine sunk position 5830 north, 2715 west. Large oil slick and debris observed. No survivors. U-223 joined 785 other U-boats lost during the war, resting in water so deep that its wreckage has never been found. The Reichweite search. After withdrawing from the North Atlantic, Dönitz ordered comprehensive investigation into Allied detection capabilities. Technical teams interviewed surviving U-boat commanders, analyzed attack reports, examined recovered Allied equipment, and attempted to understand how the enemy was finding submarines at night. The investigation, designated Reichweite range, assembled evidence from multiple sources. U-264, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hartwig Lux, survived attack by British Wellington bomber on March 18, 1943. Lux reported the aircraft appeared directly overhead without warning, despite clear night and excellent visibility. The bomber dropped depth charges that damaged the submarine but failed to sink it. Lux brought his damaged boat back to Brest and provided detailed testimony about the attack. U-230 survived attack by Canadian Liberator on April 30, 1943. Commander reported aircraft approached from astern at low altitude, appearing from darkness without warning. The attack came during moonless night when visual detection should have been impossible beyond 500 meters. The submarine crash dived, but depth charges exploded close enough to cause severe damage. Cracked battery cells, damaged diving planes, fractured hull plating. U-456 reported being attacked 3 times in one patrol by aircraft that appeared to detect the submarine regardless of weather conditions. Attacks occurred in darkness, fog, and rain, conditions where visual detection was impossible. The submarine commander concluded in his patrol report, "The enemy possesses detection equipment that operates independently of visual conditions." Multiple boats reported similar experiences. Aircraft appearing without warning, attacking with precision that suggested continuous tracking, operating effectively in total darkness or poor weather. The pattern was consistent. The Allies had detection capability that German intelligence hadn't anticipated. Examination of downed Allied aircraft provided partial answers. On June 2, 1943, German forces recovered wreckage of a British Coastal Command Wellington that had crashed near Brest while returning from patrol. The aircraft had struck a hill in fog, killing the crew but leaving much of the equipment relatively intact. Among the wreckage, Kriegsmarine technical teams found the ASV Mark III radar system. The discovery was both revelatory and shocking. German engineers who examined the system understood immediately that it represented a fundamental technological breakthrough. The cavity magnetron tube, which German physicists had believed impractical for high-power applications, was generating 10-centimeter radar wavelengths at kilowatt power levels. The antenna system was compact enough for aircraft installation, yet provided directional accuracy sufficient for navigation to target. The display system allowed operators to distinguish submarine contacts from ocean clutter. Hartmann's technical report on the recovered system, dated June 10, 1943, was devastating in its honesty. The British ASV Mark III represents a fundamental technological breakthrough that defeats our surface operations. The system provides all-weather detection of surfaced submarines at ranges exceeding 10 miles, sufficient to allow aircraft approach and attack before submarines can dive to safety. Our previous assessment that centimetric radar was impractical for aircraft installation was based on incomplete understanding of cavity magnetron technology. The British have solved problems we believed unsolvable, miniaturizing high-power radar into aircraft portable systems, developing display systems that can distinguish small targets against ocean clutter, integrating the technology with weapon systems for effective attack. The implications are catastrophic for U-boat operations. Surface running, which represents 90% of submarine operational time, is now detectable by enemy aircraft, regardless of weather, darkness, or sea state. Submarines that remain on the surface for battery charging, diesel running, or transit are vulnerable to detection and attack. We have three options: develop radar detectors that warn submarines of approaching aircraft, develop countermeasures that defeat or degrade Allied radar, or abandon surface operations entirely and develop submarines capable of sustained submerged operations. The first two options can provide marginal improvement but cannot eliminate the fundamental vulnerability. The third option requires technological developments that cannot be completed within timescales relevant to current operations. The technological gap will persist for the foreseeable future. Allied radar supremacy will continue to make surface operations extremely hazardous. The report reached Dönitz on June 15. His response, written in the margins: "We cannot abandon U-boat operations because the technology has turned against us. We must develop countermeasures and continue the battle. The alternative is surrender." The death spiral. While German engineers worked on countermeasures, U-boats attempted to continue operations using modified tactics: minimal surface time, extreme vigilance, immediate diving when aircraft were suspected. The modified tactics reduced losses from the catastrophic May 1943 peak, but also reduced effectiveness. Submarines that spent most of their time submerged couldn't intercept convoys, couldn't coordinate wolfpack attacks, couldn't sink ships. The statistics told the story of submarine force collapse. June 1943, 17, U-boats lost, 21 merchant ships sunk. July 1943, 37 U-boats lost, 61 merchant ships sunk. August 1943, 25 U-boats lost, 25 merchant ships sunk. September 1943, 11 U-boats lost, 9 merchant ships sunk. The exchange ratio had completely inverted. Instead of sinking 10 ships for every U-boat lost, Germany was losing 1 submarine for every ship sunk. An unsustainable equation when U-boat construction time was 6 months and merchant ship construction time was 6 weeks, using American mass production techniques. The psychological impact on crews was devastating. Morale collapsed as submariners understood They were sailing into what amounted to suicide missions. U-boat training schools struggled to find volunteers. Experienced sailors knew that operational submarines rarely survived more than 3 patrols. Crews that did sail were younger, less experienced, more likely to make fatal mistakes. The transformation from hunter to hunted was psychologically crushing. Submarines that had dominated the Atlantic for 3 years, attacking with impunity, sinking ships faster than they could be replaced, had become prey. They couldn't surface without risking detection. They couldn't transmit without revealing their position. They couldn't coordinate attacks without radio communication that drew enemy aircraft. Captain Lieutenant Herbert Werner, commanding U-415 through multiple patrols in late 1943, described the psychological deterioration. We had become the hunted rather than the hunters. Every time we surfaced, even for a few minutes to charge batteries, we risked detection by aircraft we couldn't see or hear until they were attacking. The crew lived in constant fear. Every time the boat came to periscope depth, every time we raised the schnorkel to run diesel engines, we knew we might be detected. The tension was unbearable. Men developed stress disorders, became unable to function, had to be relieved. Some men broke completely. I had crew members who refused to surface. They would panic when ordered to battle stations for surfacing, requiring physical restraint. Others became catatonic during attacks, unable to respond to orders, frozen by terror. We were sailing in metal coffins, and everyone knew it. The only question was when, not if, we would join the thousands of submariners already on the bottom of the Atlantic. Some men preferred that certainty. At least death would end the fear. The technical countermeasures. German engineers developed 3 primary responses to Allied radar: detection equipment, decoys, and coating technologies. The solutions were too little, too late. The Naxos radar detector entered service in autumn 1943, providing warning of aircraft radar emissions. The device detected ASV emissions at ranges theoretically exceeding the radar's detection range, giving submarines time to dive before being detected. The system worked by detecting the radar's electromagnetic emissions and providing audio warning to the submarine's bridgewatch. But the system was unreliable and generated numerous false alarms. It couldn't distinguish between distant aircraft and close threats. A submarine might dive to avoid a detected aircraft that was actually 50 miles away, wasting battery power and interrupting operations. Worse, experienced Allied air crews learned to approach submarines with radar switched off until the final moments before attack, using last known position for navigation and activating radar only when within a few miles. The Aphrodite decoy, balloon-launched radar reflectors designed to create false targets, showed more promise in testing. The decoys consisted of metallic strips suspended from hydrogen balloons, creating radar returns similar to surfaced submarines. The theory was that submarines could launch decoys before diving, drawing aircraft toward false targets while the submarine escaped. Operational deployment revealed limitations. The balloons were fragile and difficult to deploy in rough weather. They drifted with wind in patterns obviously different from moving submarines, and experienced air crews quickly learned to distinguish real submarines from reflectors. Some aircraft attacked the decoys, but most ignored them and continued searching for actual submarines. Anti-radar coating, Schornsteinfeger, chimney sweep, offered the most sophisticated technological response. The coating consisted of rubber embedded with carbon particles, designed to absorb radar energy rather than reflecting it back to the receiver. Laboratory tests showed the coating could reduce radar return by 30 and 40%, theoretically reducing detection range from 12 miles to 8 miles. But applying the coating was time-consuming. It took 2 weeks to coat a submarine properly, time that removed boats from operational service. The coating degraded quickly in seawater, requiring reapplication after each patrol. And even with coating, submarines were still detectable long before they could dive to safety. The countermeasures made marginal difference. U-boat losses declined slightly from the catastrophic May 1943 peak, but remained unsustainably high through 1944. German U-boat command was deploying technology from 2 years earlier against constantly improving Allied systems. A technological race they'd already lost. The strategic collapse. By late 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over. Allied convoys crossed the Atlantic with minimal losses. The submarine threat that had nearly starved Britain had been neutralized. U-boats continued operating through 1945, but their strategic impact was negligible compared to the devastation they'd caused in 1940–1942. The statistics document the transformation. 1942. U-boats sank 1,764 Allied ships, totaling 7.8 million tons. Germany lost 86 U-boats. Exchange ratio, 19.3 ships sunk per U-boat lost. 1943, U-boats sank 597 Allied ships, totaling 3.2 million tons. Germany lost 244 U-boats. Exchange ratio, 2.4 ships sunk per U-boat lost. 1944, U-boats sank 205 Allied ships, totaling 1.0 million tons. Germany lost 249 U-boats. Exchange ratio, 0.8 ships sunk per U-boat lost. 1945, U-boats sank 56 Allied ships totaling 0.28 million tons. Germany lost 153 U-boats. Exchange ratio, 0.4 ships sunk per U-boat lost. By 1944, Germany was losing more than one submarine for every ship sunk. The ultimate measure of strategic failure. The U-boat force that had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic had become ineffective, maintained in operation more for political reasons than military utility. Dönitz continued sending submarines to sea because admitting defeat was politically impossible under the Nazi regime. The human cost was staggering. Of 40,000 German submariners who served during World War II, 28,000 died. A 70% casualty rate, the highest of any military service in any nation during the war. The losses were concentrated in the final 2 years. In 1944–1945, being assigned to U-boat service was effectively a death sentence. Of 1,162 U-boats commissioned during the war, 785 were lost to enemy action, a loss rate of 67.5%. Another 154 were scuttled by their crews at war's end to prevent capture. Only 153 survived the war, 13% of submarines built. The metal coffins had lived up to their name. Young men, average age 21, sailed in submarines knowing they probably wouldn't return. They sailed anyway, driven by duty, patriotism, or resignation to fate. Many wrote farewell letters before departing, to be mailed only if they failed to return. Most of those letters were mailed. The human stories. Behind the statistics were individual tragedies, young men who died in metal tubes at the bottom of the ocean, far from home, often without their families ever learning the circumstances of their death. Oberleutnant Klaus Bargsten commanded U-563 until it was sunk by British corvette HMS Orkis on May 31, 1943, in the North Atlantic. Bargsten survived, one of 8 men who escaped the sinking submarine. In post-war interviews, he described the final moments. "We were surfaced at night, charging batteries when aircraft appeared overhead without warning. Depth charges fell before we could dive, the explosions crushed the after section of the boat, the stern compartments flooded instantly, killing everyone aft of the control room. The boat went down stern first, flooding compartments progressively. I gave the order to abandon ship. 8 of us made it through the conning tower hatch before the boat went under. 41 men died inside, most drowned, some crushed by pressure as the hull imploded. We floated for 6 hours before being picked up by the corvette that had sunk us. The British sailors who rescued us were professional and correct. They gave us dry clothing, hot food, medical attention. But I saw their faces when they pulled us from the water. They knew we were the lucky ones. They'd sunk dozens of U-boats. They knew that most crews didn't escape. Matrosenga freighter Hans Fischer served on U-415 under Herbert Werner through multiple patrols in 1943-1944. He survived the war and described the psychological impact of submarine service. Every patrol, we lost boats. Friends we'd trained with, crews we'd shared drinks with, men we'd known for years. They sailed out and never came back. The fear was constant. You'd be on watch in the conning tower, scanning for aircraft, knowing that if you missed spotting one early enough, everyone would die. You'd be in your bunk trying to sleep, hearing the hull creak under water pressure, wondering if the next depth charge would crush the boat. Some men broke. I saw crew members develop what we called the U-boat stare. Vacant eyes, inability to focus, jumping at every sound. They'd become useless for duty, but we couldn't evacuate them because we were at sea. They'd sit in corners, shaking, waiting for death. I survived because I got lucky. Our boat was one of the few that made it through the war. But I carry the memories, the friends who didn't come back, the boats that vanished, the certainty that we were sailing in coffins, and only blind luck determined who would survive. The post-war reckoning. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz survived the war, succeeded Hitler as German head of state for 3 weeks after Hitler's suicide, was convicted at Nuremberg of war crimes and served 10 years in Spandau prison. After his release in 1956, he wrote memoirs defending U-boat strategy and blaming defeat on Allied technological superiority that German intelligence had failed to anticipate. His assessment, published in 10 Jahre und 20 Tage, 10 years and 20 days in 1958. We lost the Battle of the Atlantic because the enemy developed detection technology our intelligence services assured us was impossible. We continued operating U-boats using tactics designed for conditions where submarines were undetectable at night. When the British deployed airborne radar that could detect surfaced submarines in any weather, our tactical advantage evaporated. We had no countermeasures, no alternative tactics, no technological response. By the time we understood what we faced, it was too late. The U-boat force had been decimated and could not recover. The tragedy is that we possessed the scientific knowledge to develop similar radar technology. Our engineers were perfectly capable of creating centimetric radar. But our intelligence assessment concluded such radar was impractical, and that conclusion prevented us from pursuing development. We failed because we underestimated our enemy's technological capability and overestimated our own intelligence services' understanding of that capability. The result was strategic defeat in a battle we should have won. British scientists who developed ASV radar were more measured in their assessment. They acknowledged that German submarines were sophisticated platforms operated by skilled, brave crews. The defeat came not from German technological inferiority, but from German intelligence failure to recognize the threat centimetric radar posed. Robert Watson Watt, British radar pioneer and developer of early warning systems, commented in his 1959 autobiography, 3 Steps to Victory. The Germans had the scientific knowledge to develop cavity magnetrons. Their physicists understood the principles. Their engineers were perfectly capable of creating centimetric radar. But they convinced themselves such radar was impractical for aircraft installation, and that conviction prevented them from developing the technology. They assumed that what they found difficult, their enemy would find impossible. We succeeded not because we were smarter, but because we recognized the operational necessity. We needed to detect submarines at night or face starvation. That necessity drove us to solve problems the Germans thought unsolvable. By the time they recognized their error, we'd deployed systems that made their submarines vulnerable. Professor R.V. Jones, British scientific intelligence officer who tracked German technological developments throughout the war, offered perhaps the most insightful analysis. The Germans suffered from what I call technical arrogance, the belief that they possessed the world's best scientists and engineers, and therefore anything they found difficult must be impossible for others. This arrogance blinded them to Allied technological achievements. When we developed cavity magnetrons, they convinced themselves we were bluffing. When their submarines started being attacked at night, they constructed elaborate explanations that didn't require accepting that we'd developed airborne radar. The result was that they continued operating using tactics that had become suicidal, because accepting that their tactics were obsolete required accepting that Allied technology had surpassed theirs. That acceptance came too late to save the U-boat force. The final accounting. Allied sailors had called U-boats metal coffins from the war's beginning, recognition that submarine service was inherently dangerous, that men who went to sea in submarines often didn't return. The nickname was initially mockery, later became respect, finally became grim accuracy as U-boat losses mounted through 1943 to 1945. For 3 years, the Coffins had been deadly, hunting across the Atlantic, sinking ships faster than Allies could replace them, bringing Britain to the edge of defeat. German submariners were skilled, brave, and operationally effective. They'd mastered wolf-pack tactics, developed effective torpedo technology, and operated submarines that were among the war's most sophisticated weapons. But technological advantage shifted decisively in 1943. Allied radar made surface operations suicidal. Direction-finding equipment revealed submarine positions. Improved sonar and depth charges made submerged operations dangerous. The hunting submarines became hunted. The metal coffins stopped surfacing because Allied technology ensured they'd never surface again. The Germans had laughed when intelligence suggested the British were developing aircraft radar capable of detecting submarines at night. The technology seemed impossible. The physics were prohibitive, the engineering impractical, the operational concept absurd. German engineers convinced themselves that Allied claims were propaganda, that submarines were safe on the surface in darkness. They were catastrophically wrong. By May 1943, the laughter had stopped and U-boats were dying at unsustainable rates. 41 submarines lost in 1 month, over 30% of the operational fleet destroyed in 30 days. The withdrawal from the North Atlantic in May 1943 marked the effective end of the U-boat threat, though submarines continued operating for 2 more years. Hans Joachim Schwantke died May 24, 1943, aboard U-223, killed by technology German intelligence had assured him was impossible. His war diary's final entry, written hours before his death, reflected confidence in German technological superiority. The crew trusts in German engineering and our tactical superiority. The enemy cannot detect us. We remain the hunters. The enemy detected his submarine at 14 miles using ASV Mark III radar, approached under cloud cover using radar for navigation, and destroyed U-223 with 6 depth charges. Schwantke and 49 crew members joined 28,000 German submariners who died during the war, victims of the technological gap that German arrogance had allowed to develop and intelligence failure had prevented from being recognized. The metal coffins had stopped surfacing, not because U-boat crews lacked courage or skill, but because Allied technology had made surface operations a death sentence. By the time German commanders understood what they faced, over 200 U-boats rested on the Atlantic floor, and the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. They laughed at the metal coffins when Allied sailors used the nickname to mock German submarines. They stopped laughing when the submarines actually became coffins, steel tombs scattered across the Atlantic floor, filled with men who'd sailed confidently into battles their intelligence services had assured them they would win. The coffins stopped surfacing because technology had shifted, because intelligence had failed, because arrogance had blinded German commanders to the possibility that the enemy might achieve what German engineers believed impossible. By the time the truth became undeniable, 28,000 submariners were dead, and the Battle of the Atlantic was lost.